The rain was heavy that night in Canary Wharf, falling fast and cold as Emily Carter stepped out of her office building long after most lights had gone dark, her heels clicking against the wet pavement while London moved around her in a blur of umbrellas and headlights, and she pulled her coat tighter not just against the weather but against the quiet ache in her chest that had followed her for months, because going home no longer felt warm or safe or even welcoming, it felt distant, like walking into a hotel room she once loved but no longer recognized. And as she stood under the awning waiting for a taxi, she checked her phone out of habit even though there were no new messages from her husband Mark, who was probably still at the office or already asleep, and she told herself not to feel disappointed, not again, but the feeling came anyway, soft and sharp at the same time, and when a black cab finally pulled up through the rain she hurried inside, grateful for the dry space and the quiet hum of the engine, barely glancing at the driver as she gave her address in Kensington, her voice calm but tired. And the taxi pulled back into traffic smoothly, the city lights reflecting across the windshield like broken stars, and after a moment the driver spoke in a warm steady voice, asking if she had a long day, not in a careless way but in a way that sounded like he actually cared about the answer, and Emily hesitated before saying yes, because it had been long in more ways than one, and she looked up at the rearview mirror and met his eyes for the first time, noticing how kind they seemed, how present, how different from the distracted faces she was used to seeing, and his name badge read Daniel Hayes, and when he smiled slightly it didn't feel forced, it felt real, and something about that simple smile made her breathe a little easier, and soft music played in the background, old American classics that reminded her of home, and she mentioned without thinking that she was from Chicago, and his eyebrows lifted with interest as he said he was from Boston, that he had moved to London a few years ago for a fresh start. And the way he said fresh start carried weight, like he understood the courage it took to leave behind a life that no longer fit, and the conversation flowed easily after that, not too personal, not too shallow, just two strangers sharing small truths between red lights and turns through the city, and Emily found herself talking more than she usually did with strangers, telling him about her work in corporate marketing, about how London had once felt exciting and new but now felt routine, and Daniel listened without interrupting, responding with thoughtful comments instead of empty words, and when traffic slowed near Westminster Bridge they both looked out at the Thames glowing under streetlights, and Emily felt something shift inside her, a quiet reminder that the world was still wide and beautiful even if her own life felt small at times, and she wondered why she felt so comfortable speaking to a man she had just met, why it felt easier to talk to him in 20 minutes than it sometimes felt to talk to her husband over dinner, and that thought startled her. Because she was not someone who looked outside her marriage for comfort, she believed in loyalty, in commitment, in building through hard seasons, yet lately every season at home felt cold, and Daniel must have sensed her sudden silence because he didn't press her with questions, he simply adjusted the music lower and focused on the road, giving her space, and that simple respect touched her more than grand gestures ever could, and when they finally reached her townhouse the rain had softened to a drizzle, and Emily hesitated before opening the door, noticing how reluctant she felt to step back into the quiet house waiting for her, and she thanked him, meeting his eyes again in the mirror, and he said any time that he was usually around the area in the evenings, his tone casual but kind, and she nodded before stepping out into the cool night air, closing the door gently as the taxi pulled away, and she stood there for a moment watching the red tail lights disappear down the street, feeling a strange mix of guilt and warmth, because nothing inappropriate had happened, no lines had been crossed, yet something inside her had been stirred awake, something she thought had faded, and as she unlocked her front door and walked into the dim hallway she was greeted by silence, no music, no laughter, no voice calling her name, and she set her keys down slowly, realizing that the most meaningful conversation of her day had taken place in the back of a taxi with a stranger from Boston who had kind eyes and a steady voice, and she tried to shake off the thought, telling herself it was just a friendly ride, just a moment in a long week. But later that night as she lay awake beside an empty space in her bed, listening to the faint sound of rain against the window, she found herself replaying the drive through London, the calm way he had listened, the simple way he had said fresh start, and she wondered why that phrase echoed so loudly in her mind, and without fully understanding why, she knew she would look for that same black cab again tomorrow evening. Not because she was searching for trouble, not because she wanted to betray anyone, but because for the first time in months she had felt seen, and that feeling, small and unexpected, followed her into sleep like the soft glow of city lights fading into the night after that rainy night. Emily told herself it was coincidence when she saw Daniel's taxi waiting near her office again, but when it happened the third evening in a row, she stopped pretending and admitted she was quietly hoping for it, and each time she slid into the back seat her heart felt lighter, as if those 20-minute rides across London had become a small escape from the silence waiting at home, and their talks grew easier, faster, more open, moving from polite small talk to real stories about childhood, family, and the strange feeling of building a life far from where you started. And Daniel shared how he once worked long hours in a finance job in Boston, chasing promotions that never satisfied him, until one day he realized he was living a life that looked impressive but felt empty. So he left, shocking everyone, and came to London to breathe again, to find something honest. And Emily admired that courage because she had done the opposite. She had chosen stability, structure, a marriage that made sense on paper, and now she was the one feeling lost. And one evening as they drove past St. Paul's Cathedral glowing against the dark sky, she admitted she missed simple things like long dinners and laughter that lasted past midnight. And Daniel listened carefully, never judging, never encouraging anything wrong, just offering space for her truth. And at home Mark was rarely present, always on calls, always planning the next deal. And when he did speak it was about schedules and flights and targets. And Emily began to notice how different it felt to be heard without distraction, how powerful it was when someone remembered small details like her favorite coffee or the fact that she loved old soul music. And Daniel remembered everything, not in a dramatic way but in quiet ways that made her feel important. And sometimes their rides were filled with laughter about cultural differences between the US and the UK, joking about British weather or American holidays, and other times there were long silences that felt comfortable instead of heavy. And one cold evening when traffic was slow near Hyde Park, Emily sighed before she could stop herself, and Daniel gently asked what was on her mind, and she surprised herself by saying that it was possible to share a house with someone and still feel completely alone, and the words hung between them, honest and fragile, and Daniel did not rush to respond. He kept his eyes on the road and said softly that everyone deserves to feel valued, and that loneliness should never be normal, and something about the calm way he said it made her throat tighten, because no one had spoken to her like that in years, and she began to understand that what she felt was not sudden passion or reckless desire but emotional closeness, a connection built slowly through shared stories and empathy. And that realization both warmed and frightened her, because she was married, because she believed in loyalty, because she never imagined herself standing near the edge of emotional betrayal, and yet she also knew that her marriage had been fading long before Daniel appeared, that the distance at home was not new, just ignored. And one night instead of sitting in the back seat she asked if she could sit in the front, laughing lightly as she said it felt less formal, and Daniel hesitated only a second before unlocking the door, and the air shifted in that small space, closer now, more personal, though nothing inappropriate happened, just two people talking under city lights, and they spoke about dreams they once had, about the careers they almost chose, about the fear of waking up at 40 and wondering where the years had gone. And Emily realized she felt alive in those conversations, not because Daniel was extraordinary in some grand way, but because he was present, because he asked questions and waited for answers, because he cared. And when he dropped her off that night she lingered a moment before stepping out, aware that she was walking a thin line, and inside her home Mark was packing for another business trip to New York. Barely looking up when she entered, and she watched him move quickly around the bedroom, efficient and distant, and she wanted to tell him about her day, about the way London looked at sunset, about the thoughts she had been carrying. But the moment passed, replaced by talk of flight times and meetings, and later as she lay awake she replayed her conversations with Daniel and felt both comfort and guilt, because nothing improper had happened yet something meaningful had begun. And the next week their routine continued, rides through Westminster, short coffee stops near the Thames after her shifts, always in public places, always careful, yet the emotional bond deepened with every honest word. And Daniel once admitted he did not want to complicate her life, that he respected her marriage, and Emily appreciated that restraint, because it showed he was not chasing drama, he was simply responding to what was naturally growing between them. And still she could not ignore the truth that she looked forward to seeing him more than she looked forward to going home, and that awareness forced her to confront uncomfortable questions about her marriage, about whether staying silent was truly loyalty or simply fear of change. And as winter air grew colder and nights arrived earlier, Emily understood that her connection with Daniel was no longer just friendly conversation, it was emotional intimacy, gentle but real. And standing at her front door one evening after another long ride filled with laughter and shared memories of American holidays, she paused before going inside, realizing that the safest part of her day now existed between office towers and quiet London streets inside a black taxi driven by a man who made her feel seen, and for the first time she wondered not whether she should stop seeing him, but whether she could continue pretending that her heart was still fully at home. Winter settled over London with sharp wind and early darkness, and as the days grew shorter, Emily felt the space between right and wrong grow thinner, because what had started as simple taxi rides had slowly turned into something deeper, something she could no longer dismiss as harmless, and one evening she walked out of her office and saw Daniel waiting across the street, his cab lights glowing softly in the cold air, and instead of climbing into the back seat she opened the front door and sat beside him without speaking, their eyes meeting for a brief second that said more than words ever could, and the drive that night was quiet at first, the city rushing past them in blurs of gold and red, until Daniel finally asked if she was okay, and she answered honestly that she did not know anymore, because every time she felt happy in his presence she also felt guilt waiting for her at home, and he tightened his hands on the steering wheel and said gently that he never wanted to be the reason her life fell apart, and she told him he wasn't the reason, that the cracks had been there long before he appeared, and as they parked near the Thames they stayed inside the cab, watching the river move under the bridge lights, and Emily admitted she had started measuring her days by their conversations, that she looked forward to hearing his voice more than she wanted to admit, and Daniel listened with a mix of warmth and caution, reminding her that feelings are powerful but choices matter more, and his words were not dramatic, just steady, and that steadiness made her trust him even more, yet it also forced her to face the truth that emotional closeness can cross lines even without physical touch, and at home Mark was preparing for another week-long trip to New York, barely noticing the new scarf she wore or the tension in her voice when she asked if they could talk, and when she finally asked him if he felt they were still happy he seemed surprised by the question, answering that they were fine, that marriage was not supposed to feel exciting all the time, and she realized then that they were living in two different emotional worlds, one where routine was enough, and one where connection was missing, and that night as she lay awake beside him she understood that she was standing at a turning point, because she could either bury her feelings and continue pretending, or she could confront the distance in her marriage honestly, and the next few days she avoided Daniel, not answering his polite message asking if she was alright, trying to create space to think clearly, but the silence felt heavy, not freeing, and she spent long evenings alone in the living room reflecting on the woman she had become, someone responsible, loyal, careful, yet quietly unhappy, and she asked herself whether loyalty meant staying no matter what or whether it also meant being truthful about when love had faded, and when Mark left for the airport again with a quick goodbye and a distracted hug, Emily felt a wave of sadness not because she would miss him but because she realized she already had, and later that evening she walked along the Thames alone, the cold air biting her cheeks, and saw Daniel's taxi parked near their usual cafe, and he stepped out when he saw her, concern clear in his eyes, and before he could speak she told him she needed to be honest with herself before anything else, that she would not allow their connection to grow in secret or in confusion, and Daniel nodded, saying he respected her too much to accept anything less than clarity, and they talked openly for the first time about the line they were approaching, acknowledging that emotional intimacy can be as powerful as romance, that it can shift hearts quietly, and Emily admitted that she felt seen with him in a way she no longer felt at home, and saying it out loud made it real, and painful, and freeing all at once, and Daniel did not reach for her or make promises, he simply said that whatever she chose, it should be because she believed in it, not because she was escaping loneliness, and those words stayed with her long after she returned home, echoing in the silence of the hallway, and she realized then that this was not a story about temptation but about truth, about whether she had the courage to face the state of her marriage without blaming anyone else, and as snow began to fall lightly outside her window that night she made a quiet decision that she would speak to Mark openly, not about Daniel, but about them, about the distance, about the emptiness that had grown between two people who once loved deeply, and for the first time she understood that the real conflict was not between two men but within her own heart, between comfort and honesty, between staying safe and seeking real connection, and as she turned off the lights and stood alone in the dark living room she knew the next conversation she had with her husband would change everything, because she could no longer pretend that her heart was untouched, and whether that meant rebuilding her marriage or walking away from it, she would choose the path in daylight, not in secret, even if it meant risking the fragile, beautiful connection that had begun inside a simple black taxi under London skies. When Mark returned from New York, Emily did not wait for the right mood or the perfect moment because she knew those rarely came, so she asked him to sit with her at the kitchen table that evening, the same table where they once planned trips and laughed over takeout boxes, and her hands were steady even though her heart raced, and she told him calmly that she felt them drifting, that she no longer felt connected, that she missed the friendship they once had, and Mark listened at first with confusion, then with a slow realization that this was not a passing complaint but something deeper, and he admitted he had poured himself into work believing success would secure their future, not seeing that their present was quietly breaking, and there were no accusations, no raised voices, only two tired people facing the truth that love cannot survive on routine alone. And Emily did not mention Daniel because this conversation was not about another man, it was about the space that had grown long before Daniel ever appeared. And Mark asked if there was someone else, not in anger but in fear, and she answered honestly that there was someone who had reminded her what it felt like to be heard, yet she also said that the real issue was not that person but the emptiness she had allowed to continue for too long, and the room fell silent as both understood that something fragile had already shifted beyond repair, and over the next weeks they tried to talk more, to have dinners without phones, to remember old memories. But the effort felt careful instead of natural, like actors replaying scenes from a past version of themselves, and one night Mark admitted he did not know how to give her what she was asking for because he no longer felt it the same way either, and that honest confession, though painful, brought clarity instead of chaos, and they agreed that staying together out of habit would only deepen resentment, so they chose separation not as enemies but as two adults who respected what they once had, and the decision was quiet, shared with close friends and family without drama, and when Mark moved into a temporary flat near his office, Emily stood alone in the doorway of their townhouse feeling both grief and relief, mourning the life she thought she would have while sensing space for something new, and she moved weeks later into a smaller apartment in Notting Hill, bright and simple, with windows that let in morning light, and for the first time in years she arranged a home entirely around her own taste, soft colors, books stacked near the sofa, music playing on slow Sunday afternoons. And during those first days she did not call Daniel because she needed to be sure that her next step came from strength, not loneliness, and she spent time reflecting, walking through Hyde Park, journaling at cafes, rebuilding her confidence outside of any relationship, and when she finally saw Daniel again it was by chance near the corner cafe where they once talked after work, his taxi parked nearby as usual, and he looked surprised but calm when their eyes met, and they stood facing each other on the sidewalk with winter sunlight between them. And Emily told him everything had changed, that she had ended her marriage respectfully, that she had chosen honesty even when it hurt, and Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression serious because he understood the weight of such a decision, and he told her he never wanted to be an escape or a secret, that he wanted to be chosen freely, and she stepped closer, not dramatically, just enough to show certainty, and said she was choosing him not because she needed saving but because she valued what they shared. And in that moment there were no fireworks, only calm understanding, and their relationship began slowly in daylight, with open conversations and patient steps, dinners in small restaurants, long walks across Westminster Bridge, shared stories about family back in Chicago and Boston, and laughter that felt easy instead of forced, and Daniel eventually left taxi driving to build a small travel planning business he had once dreamed about, and Emily supported him through the early uncertain months, just as he encouraged her when she decided to leave corporate marketing and pursue creative consulting, something she had quietly wanted for years, and their bond was built not on secrets but on transparency, because they both knew how fragile trust could be, and sometimes Emily still felt sadness when she thought about her marriage ending, but she did not regret choosing truth over comfort. And years later on another rainy London evening she would sit by her apartment window watching taxis pass below and remember the first night she stepped into Daniel's cab feeling invisible, and she would smile at how unexpected life can be, because the taxi driver had not stolen her heart in a reckless way, he had simply helped her see that it was still alive, still capable of connection, and she had done the hardest part herself by facing reality and choosing love with courage. And as she walked hand in hand with Daniel through the city they once navigated as strangers, she understood that real romance is not about dramatic beginnings but about honest endings that make room for something true, and this time her heart was not hiding, not divided, but fully present in the life she had chosen.